Jack Wilson had woken up to many surprises on his farm over the years: escaped cows, a busted tractor, even a tornado warning that turned out to be nothing more than a windy afternoon. But nothing could have prepared him for the sight that greeted him one crisp Tuesday morning in April. There it was, flapping obnoxiously in the breeze like some bureaucratic flag of conquest, an eviction notice pinned to the old oak door of his barn. Violation of HOA regulations, it read in bold, accusatory letters. Jack squinted at the paper, his callous fingers tracing the lines of legal jargon as if they might suddenly make sense. The farm had been in his family for 3 generations, long before anyone had ever heard of an HOA or cared about aesthetic standards. What in the world is this nonsense? Jack muttered under his breath, crumpling the notice and shoving it into his pocket. His dog, Rusty, wagged his tail as if to say, "I don't know either, but it smells fishy to me." Jack's farm sat on the outskirts of what used to be a sleepy rural town but had since morphed into a suburban sprawl complete with cookie-cutter houses and manicured lawns. He'd always kept to himself, figuring that if he didn't bother anyone, they wouldn't bother him. Apparently, he'd been wrong. Later that day, Jack found himself sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a growing pile of frustration. The eviction notice claimed his property violated several HOA rules: improper maintenance of structures, his barn, unauthorized livestock, his chickens, and failure to comply with landscaping guidelines, his wildflowers. The kicker? Jack wasn't even part of the HOA, or so he thought. That's when he remembered Linda Harper. Linda was the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood and president of the HOA. She was known for her iron grip on everything from mailbox colors to holiday decorations. If anyone could dream up a reason to evict a farmer from his own land, it was Linda. Jack shook his head in disbelief. "Chickens and wildflowers," he muttered. "That's what this is about? Chickens and wildflowers?" Determined to get answers, Jack drove into town to confront Linda at her office, a pristine little building that looked more like a boutique than a place where people went to argue about property lines. Linda greeted him with her trademark smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ah, Mr. Wilson," she said sweetly. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Jack wasted no time. "What's this about an eviction notice?" "My family's owned that farm since before you were born." Linda's smile tightened. "The HOA has jurisdiction over all properties within our boundaries, Mr. Wilson. Your farm included." "That's impossible," Jack shot back. "I've never signed any agreement with your HOA." Linda shrugged as if she'd heard this argument 100 times before. "It doesn't matter whether you signed anything or not. The bylaws apply to all properties within our development zone." Jack felt his blood pressure rising. "Development zone? Lady, I've got chickens older than half your neighborhood." Linda's expression hardened. "Rules are rules, Mr. Wilson." As Jack drove home, his mind raced with questions and anger. How could they just decide his farm was part of their HOA without his consent? Was there some loophole he didn't know about? And most importantly, what could he do to stop them? He pulled into his driveway and sat in silence for a moment, staring out at the land he'd worked so hard to maintain. His barn might be old and weathered, but it had character, just like him. His chickens might roam freely, but they were happy, and so was he. Jack knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going down without a fight. What would you do if someone tried to take your family home over something as ridiculous as chickens and wildflowers? Have you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories. The next morning, Jack was greeted by another unwelcome surprise. This time, it wasn't a flimsy notice pinned to his barn door, it was a certified letter waiting for him at the post office. He ripped it open in the parking lot, his boots crunching against the gravel as he read the contents. "Dear Mr. Wilson," it began, in that overly polite tone that only lawyers and bureaucrats could master. "This letter serves as formal notice of your violation of the Homeowners Association bylaws. Failure to comply with the outlined regulations within 30 days will result in legal action, including but not limited to fines, liens, and potential foreclosure proceedings." Jack's jaw tightened. Foreclosure? Over chickens and an old barn? It was absurd. He crumpled the letter in his fist and tossed it onto the passenger seat of his truck. If Linda Harper thought she could scare him off his land, she had another thing coming. That evening, Jack called up his old friend and local attorney, Mike Reynolds. Mike was a no-nonsense kind of guy who had spent years dealing with property disputes and small-town politics. If anyone could help Jack figure out what was going on, it was him. After explaining the situation over a couple of beers at Mike's office, Jack leaned back in his chair and waited for a response. Mike scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Well, here's the thing about HOAs," he said finally. "They can't just evict you outright, that's not how it works. But what they can do is pile on fines for every so-called violation. If you don't pay those fines, they can place a lien on your property. And if that lien isn't resolved, they can eventually force a foreclosure. Jack frowned. So they're trying to nickel and dime me off my own land? Pretty much, Mike replied with a shrug. It's not uncommon for HOAs to overreach their authority, especially when someone like Linda Harper is in charge. Jack sighed heavily. What are my options? Well, Mike said, leaning forward, first we need to figure out if they even have jurisdiction over your property. If your farm isn't officially part of their development zone, or if they've made any procedural mistakes, you might have a case to fight back. Over the next few days, Jack threw himself into researching HOA bylaws and property records with Mike's help. What he found only fueled his frustration. The HOA claimed that Jack's farm fell within their boundaries due to a zoning change made years ago when the surrounding neighborhoods were developed. But there was no clear documentation showing that Jack had ever agreed to be part of the HOA or that he'd even been notified about the zoning change in the first place. Meanwhile, Linda wasn't sitting idle either. She had started spreading rumors around town about Jack being a troublemaker who refused to follow community rules. Some of the newer residents, those who didn't know Jack or the history of his farm, began whispering about how he was bringing down property values with his old barn and free-range chickens. Jack couldn't believe it. He'd spent his entire life working hard, minding his own business and helping neighbors whenever they needed it, and now he was being painted as some kind of villain? One afternoon, as Jack was repairing a fence on the edge of his property, he noticed a group of neighbors standing across the road, watching him like he was some kind of sideshow attraction. One of them, a man in a polo shirt who looked like he'd never set foot on a farm in his life, called out to him. "Hey, maybe if you cleaned up this place a little, we wouldn't have to deal with all this drama." Jack straightened up and wiped the sweat from his brow. He could feel his temper rising but forced himself to stay calm. "This place," he said evenly, "has been here longer than any of you have lived in this town. And I'll be damned if I let some HOA nonsense drive me off my land." The man scoffed and turned away, muttering something under his breath as he walked back toward his car. That night, as Jack sat on his porch with Rusty at his feet and a cold beer in hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse before they got better. Linda wasn't just targeting him, she was trying to make an example out of him. But what Linda didn't know was that Jack wasn't fighting this battle alone. Just as Jack was starting to feel overwhelmed by the mounting pressure from Linda and her cronies, he heard the familiar rumble of an engine pulling into his driveway. He looked up to see none other than his brother Tom stepping out of his patrol car. Tom Wilson wasn't just any sheriff, he was the sheriff of their county, known for being fair but firm and fiercely protective of family. "Well," Tom said with a grin as he walked up to the porch, "sounds like you've gotten yourself into quite the mess here." Jack chuckled despite himself. "You could say that." Tom clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't worry, we'll figure this out together." For the first time in days, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. Linda Harper might have her lawyers and her bylaws, but Jack had something better: family. And as far as Tom was concerned, nobody messed with family on his watch. Tom leaned back in Jack's creaky kitchen chair, sipping coffee from a mug that read World's Okayest Farmer. He'd heard plenty of wild stories during his years as sheriff, but this one took the cake. An HOA trying to evict his brother from a farm that had been in their family for generations? It was laughable, if it weren't so infuriating. "Let me get this straight," Tom said, setting the mug down. "They're claiming your farm falls under their jurisdiction because of some zoning change you were never told about?" Jack nodded, his frustration evident. "And they're threatening foreclosure if I don't pay fines for things like my barn being unsightly and my chickens being unauthorized livestock. It's ridiculous." Tom smirked. "Unsightly? That barn's got more character than half the houses in this county." Jack chuckled, but the weight of the situation quickly returned. "I don't know what to do, Tom. They've got lawyers, bylaws, and half the neighborhood on their side. What do I have?" Tom leaned forward, his expression serious. "You've got me. And trust me, Jack. Linda Harper may think she runs this town, but she doesn't run the law." Over the next few days, Tom and Jack worked together to dig deeper into the HOA's claims. Tom couldn't intervene directly as sheriff. It would be seen as a conflict of interest, but he could offer advice and help Jack gather evidence. The first thing they did was review the zoning records at the county office. After hours of searching through dusty files and outdated maps, they found something interesting. While the zoning change had technically placed Jack's farm within the HOA's boundaries, there was no record of him ever signing an agreement to join the HOA or abide by its rules. "That's strike one," Tom said with a grin. Next, they turned their attention to Linda Harper herself. Tom had heard complaints about her before, stories of residents being fined for trivial things like having mismatched patio furniture or parking their cars facing the wrong direction. But what Jack didn't know was that Linda had a reputation for playing dirty. "She's been selectively enforcing rules for years," Tom explained, "targeting people she doesn't like while letting her friends slide. If we can prove she's been abusing her power, we might be able to take her down." Jack decided it was time to rally some allies of his own. He started talking to other homeowners who had been victims of Linda's tactics, people who'd been fined for things like having weeds in their yard or leaving their trash cans out too long after pickup day. One neighbor, Susan Miller, shared her story over coffee at Jack's kitchen table. "She fined me $500 because my Christmas lights weren't taken down by January 2nd, Susan said, shaking her head. "And when I tried to appeal it, she threatened to double the fine." Another neighbor, Bill Thompson, chimed in. "She charged me $1,000 for unauthorized landscaping because I planted sunflowers in my front yard." Sunflowers? Who hates sunflowers? Jack listened intently, jotting down notes as Susan and Bill spoke. The more he heard, the clearer it became. Linda wasn't just enforcing HOA rules. She was using them as a weapon. One evening, as Jack and Tom were reviewing their findings in Jack's living room, there was a knock at the door. Jack opened it to find Linda standing on his porch with two uniformed police officers behind her. "Good evening, Mr. Wilson," Linda said with a saccharine smile that made Jack's stomach churn. "I'm here to issue you a formal warning for trespassing on HOA property during your so-called investigation." Jack blinked in disbelief. "Trespassing? On my own land?" Linda shrugged innocently. "Your farm is part of our development zone now, Mr. Wilson. You should really learn to respect boundaries." Before Jack could respond, Tom stepped forward from behind him and crossed his arms. "Linda," he said coolly, "do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Linda faltered for a moment but quickly regained her composure. "Sheriff Wilson," she said with mock politeness. "I didn't realize you were involved in this matter." "I'm not involved," Tom replied evenly. "But I am here to remind you that issuing false warnings and abusing police resources is a serious offense." Linda's smile faltered again as Tom continued. "And just so we're clear, if I find out you've been harassing my brother or anyone else in this community, you'll be answering to me." The officers exchanged uneasy glances before one of them muttered something about needing to check on another call and hurried back to their cruiser. Linda glared at Tom but said nothing as she turned on her heel and marched back to her car. As Linda drove away in her shiny SUV, Jack turned to Tom with a grin. "You sure know how to make an impression." Tom chuckled and slapped Jack on the back. "Just doing my job." But Jack knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. With Linda rattled and new allies joining his cause, Jack felt more determined than ever to fight back against the HOA's overreach. The battle was heating up, and he was ready for whatever came next. Jack wasn't sure what to expect after Tom's confrontation with Linda, but he knew one thing for certain. She wasn't the type to back down quietly. Sure enough, just a few days later, the HOA escalated their tactics, and this time they weren't playing nice. It started with an email blast sent to every resident in the neighborhood. The subject line read, "Community Alert, Addressing Non-Compliance Issues." Jack's name was mentioned multiple times, accusing him of endangering property values and refusing to cooperate with HOA regulations. Linda even included photos of Jack's barn and his chickens, framing them as eyesores that were disrupting the harmony of the community. Jack's phone started buzzing almost immediately. Friends and allies called to express their support, but there were also a few less-than-friendly messages from neighbors who had clearly bought into Linda's narrative. "She's trying to turn the whole town against me," Jack muttered as he read through the email. Rusty, his loyal dog, wagged his tail obliviously, seemingly unbothered by the chaos. The next escalation came in the form of private security guards. Linda hired a small team of uniformed men to patrol the neighborhood, claiming it was necessary to maintain order and protect residents from disruptive elements. One afternoon, Jack spotted one of these guards standing at the edge of his property, clipboard in hand. Jack walked over, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Can I help you?" Jack asked, his tone sharp. The guard glanced up nervously. "Just conducting routine inspections for the HOA." Jack crossed his arms. "This is private property. You're trespassing." The guard hesitated but eventually muttered something about just following orders before retreating back toward his car. Jack shook his head in disbelief. Routine inspections? What's next? Surveillance drones. Meanwhile, Linda wasn't just targeting Jack. She was going after anyone who dared to support him. Susan Miller received a notice claiming her fence was non-compliant, while Bill Thompson was fined for having a garden hose visible from the street. It was clear that Linda was trying to intimidate Jack's allies into silence. But instead of backing down, Jack's supporters grew more determined. They started meeting at Jack's farm to share their stories and strategize ways to fight back. Each new tale of Linda's overreach added fuel to their collective fire. "She fined me $300 because my mailbox wasn't painted the exact shade of beige listed in the bylaws," one neighbor complained. "She threatened to revoke my pool privileges because my lawnmower was visible from the road," another added. By the end of the meeting, Jack had a list of grievances long enough to fill a novel, and a growing group of allies ready to take action. As tensions reached a boiling point, Linda made her boldest move yet. She filed a lawsuit against Jack for defamation. The lawsuit claimed that Jack had damaged her reputation by spreading false and malicious accusations about her leadership. When Jack received the summons, he couldn't help but laugh. "Defamation? She's got some nerve." Tom wasn't laughing. He set down his coffee cup and leaned forward. "This isn't just about shutting you up. It's about sending a message to everyone else who might try to stand up to her." Jack nodded grimly. "Well, if it's a fight she wants, it's a fight she'll get." With Mike Reynolds as his attorney and Tom offering moral support and plenty of sarcastic commentary, Jack prepared for what promised to be an intense legal battle. But he wasn't just defending himself. He was fighting for every homeowner who'd been bullied by Linda and her HOA cronies. As Mike reviewed the evidence they'd gathered, including testimonies from neighbors and financial records showing questionable expenses by Linda, he couldn't hide his excitement. "This is good," Mike said, tapping a stack of papers on his desk. "Really good. If we play our cards right, we could expose her for what she really is, a fraud." Jack grinned despite himself. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he might actually have a shot at winning this fight. But Linda wasn't done yet. She doubled down on her efforts to discredit Jack by digging into his past and spreading rumors about him around town. She even went so far as to claim that Jack had once been fined for illegal dumping. A blatant lie that only fueled Jack's determination. "She can say whatever she wants," Jack told Tom one evening as they sat on his porch. "I'm not going anywhere." Tom nodded in agreement. "Good, because neither am I." The battle lines were drawn, and both sides were gearing up for war. With tensions running high and stakes higher than ever, Jack knew that the next move would be critical, and he was ready for whatever came next. The courthouse was packed. Word had spread quickly about the lawsuit between Linda Harper, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, and Jack Wilson, the stubborn farmer who refused to back down. It seemed like half the town had shown up to watch the drama unfold. Some were there to support Jack, while others, mostly Linda's loyalists, were eager to see him put in his place. Jack sat at the defendant's table with his lawyer, Mike Reynolds, by his side. Mike looked calm and confident, flipping through a thick stack of papers that represented weeks of preparation. Jack, on the other hand, felt like a bundle of nerves. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not in a courtroom. Across the aisle, Linda sat with her own legal team, wearing a smug expression that made Jack's blood boil. She seemed to relish the attention, waving politely to a few of her supporters in the audience as if she were some kind of celebrity. "Don't let her get under your skin," Mike whispered. "We've got this." The trial began with Linda's lawyer presenting her case. He painted Linda as a dedicated community leader, who had been unfairly maligned by Jack's baseless accusations. He claimed that Jack's public comments about Linda's corruption had caused her emotional distress and damaged her reputation. Linda took the stand and delivered a performance worthy of an Oscar. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as she described how Jack's actions had made her feel unsafe in her own neighborhood. "I've always tried to do what's best for our community," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "But Mr. Wilson has made it impossible for me to do my job." Jack clenched his fists under the table but kept his mouth shut. He knew better than to let Linda bait him into an outburst. When it was Mike's turn to present Jack's defense, he wasted no time getting straight to the point. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mike began, addressing the jury with a confident smile, "this case isn't about defamation, it's about power, specifically one person's abuse of power." He proceeded to lay out a compelling argument, backed by evidence that painted a very different picture of Linda Harper. He presented financial records showing that Linda had used HOA funds for personal expenses, including spa treatments and luxury vacations. He introduced testimonies from neighbors who described how Linda had selectively enforced HOA rules to target people she didn't like. One particularly damning piece of evidence was an email exchange between Linda and another HOA board member in which she referred to Jack as a nuisance we need to get rid of. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Mike revealed each new piece of evidence. Even some of Linda's supporters looked uneasy as the truth about her actions came to light. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Jack took the stand. Mike guided him through his testimony, asking him about his farm, his family's history on the land, and his interactions with Linda and the HOA. Jack spoke plainly and honestly, his voice steady despite the pressure. "This farm has been in my family for 3 generations," he said. "I've worked hard every day of my life to take care of it. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I'm just trying to protect what's mine." Linda's lawyer attempted to rattle Jack during cross-examination, bringing up unrelated incidents from years ago, like a noise complaint from when Jack hosted a 4th of July barbecue. But Jack handled it with humor and grace. "So you're saying my fireworks display was too loud?" Jack said with a grin. "Well, I guess I'll take that as a compliment." Even the judge chuckled at that one. As the trial continued, it became clear that Linda was losing ground. Her lawyer grew increasingly flustered as Mike dismantled their arguments piece by piece. By the time closing statements rolled around, it was obvious which way things were leaning. Mike ended his statement with a powerful appeal to the jury. "This case isn't just about Mr. Wilson. It's about standing up to bullies who think they can use their position of power to intimidate others. I ask you to send a message today that no one is above accountability." The jury deliberated for only an hour before returning with their verdict. Not guilty. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding as relief washed over him. The courtroom erupted into applause from his supporters, while Linda sat frozen in disbelief. But it wasn't over yet. The judge announced that based on the evidence presented during the trial, he was ordering an independent audit of the HOA's finances and operations. Furthermore, all pending fines against homeowners, including those imposed on Jack, were suspended until further notice. Linda's face turned beet red as she realized what this meant. Her reign as HOA president was effectively over. As Jack walked out of the courthouse surrounded by friends and supporters, he couldn't help but smile. For once, it felt like justice had been served. "Looks like you won," Tom said with a grin as he clapped Jack on the shoulder. Jack nodded. "Yeah. But more importantly, we all won." Linda Harper had always loved being the center of attention, but this was not the kind of attention she had in mind. The independent audit ordered by the judge was swift and thorough, and the results were nothing short of catastrophic, for Linda at least. The auditors uncovered years of financial mismanagement and outright theft. HOA funds that were supposed to go toward community improvements had instead been used to fund Linda's lavish lifestyle. There were receipts for spa treatments, first-class plane tickets, expensive dinners, and even a $3,000 designer handbag, all paid for with HOA money. The news spread through the community like wildfire. The same neighbors who had once supported Linda now turned against her in droves. People were furious, not just because of the money she had stolen, but because they had trusted her to act in their best interests. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication as he watched Linda's empire crumble. He wasn't one to revel in someone else's misery, but after everything she had put him through, it was hard not to enjoy the poetic justice of it all. He found himself at the local diner one morning, sipping coffee and reading the front page of the town newspaper. The headline read, "HOA President Resigns Amid Scandal." Below it was a photo of Linda looking decidedly less smug than usual. "Well," Jack said to no one in particular, "looks like karma finally caught up with her." The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Betty who had known Jack since he was a kid, chuckled as she poured him another cup of coffee. "About time, if you ask me. That woman's been causing trouble since the day she moved here." Linda's resignation was just the beginning. The HOA board held an emergency meeting to address the fallout from the audit. Residents packed into the community center, eager to voice their frustrations and demand accountability. Jack attended the meeting out of curiosity more than anything else. He sat quietly in the back as one homeowner after another stood up to share their grievances. "She fined me $200 for having my trash cans out an hour early," one man said angrily. "She made me repaint my front door 3 times because it wasn't the right shade of blue," a woman added. By the time it was Jack's turn to speak, the room was buzzing with anger and resentment. "I think we've all learned an important lesson here," Jack said as he stood at the microphone. "Power without accountability leads to abuse. We trusted Linda to do what was best for this community, and she betrayed that trust. Now it's up to us to make sure this never happens again." His words were met with applause and cheers from the crowd. For once, it felt like people were united not just against Linda, but for something better. But just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse for Linda, they did. A few weeks after her resignation, she was formally charged with embezzlement and fraud. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and even her most loyal supporters couldn't deny her guilt. The trial was quick and decisive. Linda pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, but it didn't save her from public humiliation or from having to pay restitution to the HOA. Jack couldn't help but laugh when he heard that Linda would be spending 6 months doing community service as part of her punishment. The thought of her picking up trash on the side of the road while wearing an orange vest was almost too good to be true. With Linda gone and her influence finally broken, the HOA began rebuilding under new leadership. The new board members were determined to restore trust within the community and repair the damage Linda had done. One of their first actions was to officially declare Jack's farm outside of HOA jurisdiction. It turned out that Linda had manipulated zoning records to include his property, a move that was not only unethical but also illegal. When Jack received the official letter confirming his exemption from HOA rules, he framed it and hung it on his kitchen wall next to an old family photo. "Well," he said with a grin as he showed Tom the letter, "I guess that settles that." Tom chuckled. You know what they say, don't mess with a Wilson. As life returned to normal on his farm, Jack found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. It hadn't been easy standing up to Linda and the HOA, but in the end, it had been worth it. Not just for himself, but for everyone in the community who had suffered under her reign. He realized that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you. And sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually win. The sun was setting over Jack Wilson's farm, casting a warm golden glow over the fields. It had been a long, grueling battle, but for the first time in months, Jack felt at peace. Linda Harper was gone. Her reign of terror over the HOA had ended, and his farm was finally safe from her meddling. But Jack wasn't one to dwell on the past. He believed in moving forward, and what better way to celebrate than with a good old-fashioned community barbecue? He'd spent the last few days preparing for it, hauling out picnic tables, setting up a grill, and even stringing up some lights around the barn. It was a lot of work, but it felt worth it. Neighbors began arriving just as the sky turned a dusky pink. Some brought side dishes, potato salad, baked beans, coleslaw, while others brought desserts or drinks. Jack manned the grill, flipping burgers and hot dogs while Rusty, his trusty dog, trotted around happily accepting scraps from anyone willing to share. The mood was light and festive, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped the community just weeks earlier. People laughed and chatted as they filled their plates, and for the first time in a long time it felt like everyone was on the same page. Tom arrived late, still in his sheriff's uniform after a long day at work. He grabbed a plate of food and sat down next to Jack at one of the picnic tables. "Well," Tom said with a grin, "looks like you've got yourself quite the crowd here." Jack chuckled. "Yeah, I guess people like free food." "It's not just the food," Tom said. "They're here because you stood up for them. You showed them that they didn't have to put up with Linda's nonsense anymore." Jack shrugged modestly. "I just did what anyone would have done." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Not everyone would have fought as hard as you did, or stuck it out as long as you did. You should be proud of yourself." Jack smiled but didn't say anything. He wasn't used to being praised. It felt strange, but deep down he knew Tom was right. He was proud of what he'd accomplished. As the night went on, people began sharing stories about their experiences with Linda and the HOA. There was plenty of laughter, especially when someone mentioned Linda's community service sentence. But there were also moments of reflection. "I think we all learned something from this," Susan Miller said as she stood up to address the group. "It's easy to feel powerless when someone like Linda is in charge. But Jack showed us that we don't have to accept it. We can stand up for ourselves and for each other." Her words were met with applause and cheers from the crowd. "Here's to Jack," Bill Thompson shouted, raising his cup of lemonade in a toast. "To Jack," everyone echoed. Jack raised his own cup with a sheepish grin. All right, enough about me. Let's eat before these burgers get cold." As the evening wound down and people started heading home, one neighbor approached Jack with a mischievous smile. "You know," she said playfully, "we were talking earlier about how we need new leadership for the HOA now that Linda's gone." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? What does that have to do with me?" "Well," she continued, "we were thinking, maybe you should run for HOA president." The suggestion caught Jack completely off guard. For a moment, he thought she might be joking, but then he realized she was serious. "Me?" Jack said incredulously. "HOA president? Are you kidding? I just spent months fighting those people." The woman laughed. "Exactly. Who better to make sure they don't pull any more stunts like this?" Jack shook his head with a chuckle. "Thanks for the vote of confidence, but I think I'll stick to farming." The woman shrugged good-naturedly. "Fair enough, but if you ever change your mind, you've got my vote." As she walked away, Jack turned to Tom with an amused expression. "Can you believe that? Me, HOA president?" Tom smirked. "Hey, stranger things have happened." Jack laughed and took another sip of his lemonade. For now, he was content to let someone else deal with HOA politics. After all, he had chickens to tend to and wildflowers to grow, and that suited him just fine. As Jack stood on his porch later that night, looking out at his quiet farm under a blanket of stars, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The fight had been tough, messy even, but it had brought people together in ways he hadn't expected. And if there was one thing he'd learned through it all, it was this. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about protecting what's yours. It's about showing others that they can stand their ground too. With Rusty curled up at his feet and the distant sound of crickets filling the air, Jack smiled to himself. "Here's to peace and quiet," he muttered softly. For now, and hopefully for a long time to come, that's exactly what he had.